Hello everyone, I am Brett Yardley and I am a PhD candidate at KU Leuven and Marquette University, and right now I'm going to be introducing us to al-Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers. And this is important because in his introductions and his preface he outlines exactly what he'll be doing, and that helps us to avoid some of the issues that people have made when citing the incoherence and ascribing various ideas and views to al-Ghazali. Help us to get ready to dive into the various discussions and understand exactly what it is al-Ghazali is doing. So first things first, I thought I would give us just a brief synopsis of al-Ghazali and his life. He was born in 1058, just to put him in perspective of some of the other thinkers, and he was trained and studied for quite some time under al-Juwani, a famous Asharite instructor, and there he was instructed in or learned philosophy, theology, and law. As we'll see later on, he adopts many mystical ideas from Sufism, but as of right now, he focused primarily on these three areas. And after al-Juwani's death, he goes on to be named the Nizamiyya, which was one of the highest intellectual positions that could be held at the time. In fact, he was very close to the court in Baghdad and some of the highest rulers of the land. And it's at this time, you might say, the height of his academic career, at least politically, socially speaking, is when he wrote the Incoherence of the Philosophers. Of note, this is also when he wrote the Aims of the Philosophers, which was a text that got picked up into the Latin tradition, although without the introduction. So they thought that al-Ghazali was quite the philosopher and enamored with Avicenna, whereas he was just laying out Avicenna's views, and without the introduction, they didn't realize that, again, what he was doing was contrary to the philosophers. And I also mention here, or list here, the moderation in belief, which comes up a little bit later in the discussion in identifying some of al-Ghazali's views. Now, a major turning point in al-Ghazali's life is his so-called crisis of 1095. At this particular time, a lot of different factors led to al-Ghazali walking away from this highest academic position in the land. And he ends up going on sort of a pilgrimage, or leads a pilgrim's life. He made arrangements for his family to be taken care of, and then he went to Damascus and lived in the minaret, and he went to Jerusalem and the Dome of the Rock, and he went to Medina, Mecca, and all at this time we really see heavy influences from Sufism, as he's looking for some kind of higher way, some more certain knowledge. And it's also at this time when he writes another one of his famous works, The Revivification of the Sciences of Religion. But then later we see, in 1106, he returns to teaching, which is quite interesting because at the beginning of his crisis, he vowed at the tomb of Abraham that he would never go back and serve politics with his education and with his intellect, but here he's doing that. And so he's returned to teaching, and he writes his autobiography, often referred to as the Deliverance from Error, although I think Deliverer from Error is a less Orientalist interpretation of the title. And there in his autobiography, and much of what he's doing is going through the various approaches to knowledge, some of the different methods and ways of the different camps, and delivering them from error, if you will, as to what the right way is. But he also takes this opportunity to sort of justify how he could come back after he vowed not to. And then not too much later on, he passes away in 1111, again in the city he was born, the city of Tus, which can be found, it was northeast Persia at the time, but is now in modern-day Iran, I believe. And his tomb, not too long ago, they built a mausoleum on top of it. So this brings us to the actual work itself. Now, the Incoherence of the Philosophers is an important work within the history of philosophy because it definitely shows a direct confrontation between Kalam, which is We might consider it the Islamic version of theology and philosophy. And in the Incoherence, al-Ghazali is advancing a nominalist critique of Aristotelian science. Now, I wanted to provide a quick word on the title itself. The Incoherence, or tahafut, in the title has been variously translated. In Latin, it was originally interpreted or translated as destructio, in which case we tend to get this idea that somehow Ghazali brought about the destruction of philosophy and science in the lands of Islam. This is quite an uncharitable translation, but it has stuck around even to this day. A couple of years ago, I even heard Neil deGrasse Tyson, a contemporary cosmologist, who was saying that if it hadn't been for al-Ghazali, then science wouldn't have died in the lands of Islam and become what it is today, just producing theology and other backward science. But otherwise, you'll see kind of similar interpretations or translations, whether it's disintegration or collapse. But most commonly, you're going to see something along the lines of inconsistency or incoherence, as we have here. I've even seen precipitousness, which tries to interpret tahafut in this sense as kind of what the philosopher is doing is them rushing in headlong with their project. It was done quickly without any sort of careful consideration for where these arguments may lead. So just so you know where the actual translation of the title is coming from. Now, interestingly, if al-Ghazali did set out to destroy philosophy in the lands of Islam, then his work had the opposite effect. So insofar as he went on explaining the doctrines of philosophy, both in the aims of the philosophers and in this particular work, the Incoherence, he actually did such a good job of explaining it that it was incorporated into Kalam. And whether that was to teach what the philosophers were teaching so that it could be refuted, or whether that was, as we're going to see, the incorporation of the logic and the science side of philosophy into Kalam, is debated. Now, beyond that, Averroes, he provides a critique of al-Ghazali with his Incoherence of the Incoherence. And interestingly, again, if his aim was to shut down al-Ghazali and ensure that his work was not carried on, it had the opposite effect. Because part of the Incoherence of the Incoherence, Averroes is basically replicating al-Ghazali's work and basically saying this is what Ghazali said and then refuting it. And insofar as Averroes' work is then passed on, the ideas of al-Ghazali get picked up in later Jewish and Latin medieval thinkers. So this brings us to the actual preface or introductions that al-Ghazali gives. And in fact, he gives 4 introductions in addition to the preface. And he's really trying to explain to his readers what it is he's about. And in one of my favorite quotes, he says, quote, "When I perceived this vein of folly throbbing within these dimwits, I took it upon myself to write this book in refutation of the ancient philosophers, to show the incoherence of their belief and the contradiction of their word in matters relating to metaphysics, to uncover the dangers of their doctrines and its shortcomings, which in truth ascertainable are objects of laughter for the rational and a lesson for the intelligent." End quote. So al-Ghazali sort of paints this picture reminiscent of Plato's Apology, in which we have the philosophers being Socrates running around corrupting the youth. Here we have these speculative thinkers who are drawn to philosophy or potentially using it as some kind of smoke screen to avoid orthopraxy, leading them into various forms of atheism. And so he calls out these pseudo-intellectuals or want-to-be philosophers, claiming that they don't actually understand philosophy. In fact, what they're really doing is they have a blind faith in Islam, and they're trading that, and blind faith is taqlid, and they're trading that blind faith for yet another blind faith. He calls these individuals accepting philosophy as another form of taqlid, because they are just being drawn to these, as he says, high-sounding names of Plato and Aristotle, and describes a form of confirmation bias, in which these particular individuals, they want to sound smart, they want to be perceived like this, and they don't want to necessarily follow the teachings of Islam, and this fits the bill. So that's why they're actually drawn to it. Now, getting into the different introductions, we can see again what al-Ghazali's project is, who he's targeting, and again we can figure out how he's going about that. And here in the first introduction, he explicitly states that he is going to be addressing Aristotle, and specifically his followers in the Islamic world of al-Farabi and Avicenna. And then from there he outlines the methodological procedures that he's going to be using. And so in fact he's going to be explaining the method and the positions of the philosophers, so their logic and the use of demonstration. And in fact, you might say he did such a good job of explaining it, making them less obscure. That's one of the reasons why it got spread even further. And as he explains some of their other ideas, just relying on geometry, math, the logical sciences, he really accepts these, or at least is giving them a huge pass, and would definitely seem that he's accepting them wholesale. And again, he's calling out philosophy as having sort of this taqlid mentality, and he's questioning the certainty, or that certainty that can even be derived from the philosophical methodology, because much of their works from Aristotle had to be translated from different languages, and then they had to be transmitted from person to person, and all of this is, he says, corrupt and suspect to change. But as we're going to see, his primary method is going to be to show that the philosophers' positions really fail based off of their own method. So he wants to show that even using the philosophers' method, so granted that we start with the philosophers do, and we use demonstration and logic, they can't actually prove what they set out to prove. So moving on to the second introduction, he is going to be showing exactly what disagreement he's focusing on. And he really lists three different kinds of disagreements that exist and what he's doing. So in the first two, he's not interested. In the first two, one is verbal, the idea being that Kalam and philosophy, they're just using different terms to talk about the same thing. They're talking about the first cause, we talk about God. At the end of the day, these are the same, and there's no reason for dispute. Once we have all the terms clarified, let's move on. Next, he gets into non-theological doctrines of the philosophers. And here he's talking about whenever philosophy is talking about something that doesn't contradict with any of the core beliefs about God and the prophets. And again, he says, I'm not interested in these. There's no real contradiction. If science is, want to, claim this, that, or the other, then let them claim that. That's fine. And in fact, his example is of an eclipse and how that occurs and he says it's actually dangerous. In fact, atheists love it the most when you have some uninformed individual refuting them on these mathematical or scientific points, because it just makes religion look dumb. So again, he says if they want to assert these things that don't have any conflict with religion, let them do that. I'm not going to say anything about it. You would also see that he's agreeing with them on many of these points. At least he seems to be saying such. And then the last area is the principles of religion, which are specifically their issues on metaphysics. And so as he puts it, any philosophy doctrine that's going to come into conflict or is going to contradict the core religious teachings, then al-Ghazali is, quote, taking it upon himself to, quote, show the falsity of their doctrine, end quote. And he specifically will list off things such as the world's creation, the divine attributes, and then religious doctrines such as bodily resurrection. So moving on to the third introduction, we are shown, again, what al-Ghazali's primary aim is, and he's really setting out to show the errors in philosophy. It's not this perfect science, or maybe it's not everything that the philosophers say it is, or it's definitely not everything that these particular individuals drawn to philosophy think it is. As he says, quote, let it be known that our objective is to alert those who think well of the philosophers and believe that their ways are free from contradiction by showing the various aspects of their incoherence, end quote. And as a result, we really get the main thrust of al-Ghazali's project, which is a negative one. He is out to refute the doctrines of the philosophers. And as such, he's never going to be giving a positive account of what individuals should believe. So in other words, he's not going to say that this is the right way. He's only going out to show that, and as a result, this particular philosophical doctrine doesn't work. So much of, or all of the incoherence is just showing what not to believe. And this gets really important because al-Ghazali is going to use any counter-argument at his disposal. And these will often not reflect his own position. He's just going, if it works, if it shows the incoherence of the philosophers, I'm going to use it. One of the famous examples comes from discussion 17 as to causality and whether or not al-Ghazali is an occasionalist. In that particular discussion, he gives two different counter-arguments. One, the Asherite view of occasionalism, in which God's will is directly necessary for connecting each and every consecutive event. And then he gives a second contradiction, being or a counter-argument of a modified Aristotelianism. So the question becomes, which one did al-Ghazali hold to, especially since he was taught by al-Juwani and the school of Asherism? And so you'll see that in his form, you have to go to another work. And so Marmura will argue that in the Iqtisad that al-Ghazali is actually going to be holding to the Asherite position of occasionalism, because in that work he defends it once again, or gives it as a positive account. And on the other hand, you'll see Frank Griffel in some of his work saying this is still insufficient, and he will defend that, or argue that al-Ghazali is not an occasionalist. And again, it gets challenging when you jump into some of these works, but it's good to know that you can't just say, al-Ghazali uses it as a counter-argument, therefore he believes that. In fact, he's giving this sort of the enemy of my is my friend philosophy or approach, in which case, if he's going to be heavily drawing upon or readily drawing upon ideas from various schools of thought, various religious schools, which often contradict each other, just to show the incoherence of these philosophical views. And this brings us to the fourth and final of the introductions. And again, we see that far from refuting philosophy, al-Ghazali is very accepting of large swaths of what we consider to be philosophy, their doctrines and method, the only exception again being their metaphysics. And the biggest area of this is the logical sciences. It comes right out and says, in agreement with the philosophers, yes, we have to have logic mastered. But what he denies is that logic exclusively belongs to the philosophers. And he lists several works of logic written by the theologians or the Kalama. In fact, in one of his own other works, the Al-Kistas, he even shows how logic can be shown, taught, derived from the Quran. So here he is saying that in his introduction, quote, "But when the one seeking to be clever who is weak hears the name logic, he thinks it is an unfamiliar art, unknown to the theologians, known only to the philosophers." End quote. And obviously he thinks this is false. And so al-Ghazali is, again, trying to show, his whole project is trying to show that the philosophical doctrines taught by the philosophers are really illogical by their own method. So his goal is to say, well, let's grant them these positions. Let's start with logic, and we'll move from there. And what we'll find is that they really can't come to the conclusions they want to conclude. Or at the end of some of the discussions, he'll say, the logic can't make this jump. And so maybe it's inconclusive as to whether we should go in the direction of Kalam or we should go in the direction of philosophy just based off of the logic alone. But if that's the case, then why would you accept the philosophical solution? Because the only reason why you're doing that is taqlid. And quite frankly, why shouldn't you accept what's been taught and handed down by revelation, which is, in his terms, certain? So even if you come to an impasse, you should still be siding with revelation. And so he writes out here, quote, "We will make it plain that what they set down as a condition for the truth of the matter of the syllogism in the part on demonstrating their logic, and what they set forth as a condition for its form in the book of the syllogism, and the various things they posited in the isagoge and the categories, which are parts of logic and its preliminaries, are things none of which have they been able to fulfill in their metaphysical sciences." So this brings us to the end of the introductions to the introductions. And so I just want to leave you here with a few additional resources in case you're new to al-Ghazali. First and foremost, Ghazali.org. There's a virtual online library which has many of his works available in both Arabic and English for download. There's also an Arabic grammar on there. In terms of the Incoherence itself, I'll be reading Michael Mamura's translation. Make sure you note that there are two editions. There is a first and a second, the second being the 2002 edition. And another good introduction to al-Ghazali would just be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article by Frank Griffel. So at this point, we're going to have some time for discussion, and we can just have some comments or questions on al-Ghazali and what he's up to in the Incoherence. And then after that, we will turn to Avicenna, because it's a really good idea to figure out what it is that al-Ghazali is refuting. So I will see you in the discussion.